At approximately 3:30 a.m. on August 5, 1962, in a quiet Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles, a housekeeper stood outside a locked bedroom door and sensed that something was wrong. Inside the home at 12305 Fifth Helena Drive lay Marilyn Monroe, one of the most photographed, scrutinized, and mythologized figures of the 20th century. She was 36 years old. By dawn, police would arrive. By mid-morning, the news would circle the globe. And by the end of the day, the world would be told that her death was the result of acute barbiturate poisoning, ruled a probable suicide. But even in those first hours, uncertainty crept in. Accounts conflicted, timelines shifted, key details were unclear or disputed. The bedroom door had been locked. The phone was clutched in her hand. Empty pill bottles sat nearby. Yet no glass of water was found. No suicide note was discovered. And witnesses could not agree on who arrived first, what lights were on, or whether the scene had already been disturbed before authorities documented it. Marilyn Monroe's death was officially closed within weeks. But almost immediately, questions surfaced, quietly at first, then persistently, and eventually relentlessly. Was this the tragic end of a woman overwhelmed by personal struggles? Or was it something else? Something interrupted, misinterpreted, or deliberately concealed? More than 60 years later, the same question still lingers. What really happened in that bedroom, in the final hours of Marilyn Monroe's life? What do you think really happened in Marilyn Monroe's final hours? Share your thoughts in the comments. For more true crime and historical mysteries broken down with facts, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Don't miss the next investigation. Check the description for sources and documents if you want to explore the evidence yourself. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was not merely a film star. She was a global symbol of glamour, vulnerability, desire, and contradiction, existing at the intersection of Hollywood celebrity, Cold War politics, and American cultural anxiety. To understand why her death resonated so deeply, and why it continues to invite scrutiny decades later, it is necessary to step back and examine the world Marilyn Monroe inhabited and the forces that surrounded her in the final years of her life. She was born Norma Jean Mortensen on June 1st, 1926, in Los Angeles. Her childhood was unstable and fragmented. She spent time in foster homes and orphanages, and her mother struggled with severe mental illness. These early experiences would later be cited, sometimes carelessly, as explanations for her adult vulnerabilities. But they also shaped a woman who was intensely observant, deeply ambitious, and acutely aware of how power operated in relationships. Marilyn Monroe was not an accidental star. She worked deliberately to become one. After signing with 20th Century Fox in the late 1940s, she transformed herself through acting classes, vocal training, and image cultivation. By the early 1950s, she had become one of Hollywood's most bankable actresses, starring in films such as Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire, and The 7-Year Itch. Her on-screen persona projected ease and innocence, but off-screen she fought for better contracts, creative control, and respect in an industry that rarely offered any of those things to women, particularly women marketed primarily for their appearance. By the mid-1950s, Monroe was one of the highest-paid actresses in the world. She had also begun openly challenging the studio system, forming her own production company and demanding more serious roles. These decisions earned her admiration from some and resentment from others. Hollywood, at the time, was not forgiving of stars, especially female stars, who disrupted established hierarchies. Alongside professional pressure came personal strain. Marilyn Monroe suffered from chronic insomnia, anxiety, and periods of depression. She sought treatment from psychiatrists and relied heavily on prescription medications, particularly barbiturates and sedatives, which were widely prescribed in the 1950s and early 1960s. At the time, medical understanding of drug interactions and dependency was limited, and prescriptions were often managed informally, sometimes by multiple doctors simultaneously. This context is important. Monroe's use of medication, while later cited as evidence of suicidal tendencies, was not unusual for someone in her position during that era. What was unusual was the extent to which her private medical life became public property, interpreted, simplified, and often distorted after her death. By 1962, Monroe's career was at crossroads. She had recently been fired from the film Something's Got to Give after repeated absences from the set, though negotiations were underway for her reinstatement. Contrary to later narratives portraying her as professionally finished, studio records indicate that Fox executives were still interested in continuing their relationship with her. Other projects were being discussed. She had signed new contracts. She had spoken to friends about plans, travel, work, and personal reinvention. At the same time, Marilyn Monroe existed in close proximity to political power. The early 1960s were a period of intense geopolitical tension. The Cold War dominated American consciousness. The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed. The Cuban Missile Crisis loomed just months away. National security, secrecy, and image control were not abstract concerns. They were daily operational priorities for the U.S. government. Within this environment, Monroe moved among influential figures. She had friendships and relationships with politicians, athletes, executives, and entertainers. Most notably, persistent rumors and later biographical claims linked her romantically to President John F. Kennedy and, separately, to his brother Robert F. Kennedy, who served as Attorney General of the United States. These alleged relationships were never confirmed by official sources, but they were widely discussed in Hollywood circles and among journalists. At the time, such associations carried risk, not only personal scandal, but political consequences. The Kennedy administration cultivated a carefully managed public image. Any suggestion of impropriety, particularly involving a high-profile celebrity, was considered dangerous. It is within this charged environment that Marilyn Monroe's final months unfolded. She was simultaneously vulnerable and powerful, celebrated and isolated, closely watched and poorly protected. Her phone calls were reportedly monitored by federal agencies, not because she was suspected of wrongdoing, but because of who she knew and who might speak to her. This surveillance culture was real and documented. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, maintained files on numerous public figures, particularly those with political connections. Monroe's name appears in several declassified documents, though the extent and purpose of that attention remain debated. By August 1962, Marilyn Monroe was living alone in her Brentwood home. She had recently dismissed some staff and relied heavily on a small circle of aides, doctors, and friends. Her emotional state, according to those close to her, varied. Some described her as fragile. Others described her as hopeful and energized. These conflicting portraits would later become central to the mystery, because when Marilyn Monroe died, the world did not lose a private citizen. It lost a cultural symbol, one entangled with Hollywood economics, medical practices of the era, political secrecy, and a media machine that demanded simple explanations for complex lives. And it is against this backdrop of fame, pressure, medication, power, and silence that the events of August 4th and 5th, 1962, must be examined. The setting matters. The relationships matter. The systems surrounding her matter. Only then can the final hours be reconstructed with clarity. What follows is a reconstruction of Marilyn Monroe's final known hours, based strictly on police reports, coroner records, sworn testimony, contemporaneous press accounts, and later statements from those present. Where accounts conflict, those discrepancies are identified clearly. Where time gaps exist, they are left open. The goal is not to dramatize the night, but to slow it down, minute by minute where possible, until the sequence itself becomes visible. On the evening of Saturday, August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was at her home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. The residence was a single-story Spanish-style house she had purchased earlier that year. It sat behind a gated driveway, relatively secluded, offering privacy in a city that rarely afforded her any. Present at the house that evening were Eunice Murray, Monroe's longtime housekeeper, and Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist. Marilyn had been under Greenson's care for several years, seeing him frequently, sometimes daily, in the weeks leading up to her death. According to Greenson's later statements, he visited Monroe earlier that day and again in the evening. He described her as emotionally unsettled, but not suicidal. He claimed she had been talking about the future, including upcoming projects and personal plans. These remarks would later become important, as they conflicted with the official conclusion of suicide. At approximately 7 p.m., Greenson left the house. His account suggests that Marilyn intended to go to bed early. Eunice Murray remained in the home overnight, sleeping in a separate room. What happened between that moment and the early morning hours is where certainty begins to fracture. At some point during the late evening, Marilyn Monroe made or received several phone calls. Phone records from the time were limited, and many calls were reportedly routed through operators. Some individuals later claimed to have spoken with her that night, though these claims vary in reliability. One confirmed call was to Peter Lawford, actor and brother-in-law to President John F. Kennedy. According to Lawford's later account, Monroe sounded distressed. He said she spoke in fragmented sentences and made remarks that concerned him. Lawford claimed he urged her to seek help and later attempted to call back, but received no answer. Other alleged calls to friends, acquaintances, and possibly political figures have been reported in biographies but lack documentation. What is clear is that Marilyn was awake late into the night. At approximately midnight, Eunice Murray reportedly noticed Marilyn's bedroom light was still on. She later stated that this was not unusual. Monroe often struggled with insomnia and frequently stayed awake through the night. Sometime after midnight, Murray claimed she sensed something was wrong. Her descriptions vary across interviews. In some versions, she said she became uneasy around 2:30 a.m. In others, closer to 3 a.m. What she consistently reported was this: Marilyn's bedroom door was closed and locked from the inside, and light was visible under the door. Murray knocked. There was no response. She attempted the doorknob. It would not open. According to Murray, she did not immediately call the police. Instead, she contacted Dr. Ralph Greenson. This decision would later draw scrutiny. Greenson arrived at the house sometime between 3:15 and 3:30 a.m. The exact time is unclear. What is documented is his account of what he found upon arrival. Unable to access the bedroom through the locked door, Greenson looked through a window. He later stated that he saw Marilyn lying face down on the bed, nude, with a telephone receiver in her hand. Greenson broke a window to gain entry. Once inside, he confirmed that Marilyn Monroe was dead. Only after this did calls to emergency services and law enforcement occur. The Los Angeles Police Department received notification at approximately 4:25 a.m. Officers arrived shortly thereafter. By that time, multiple individuals had already entered the bedroom. This is a critical point. The scene was not preserved in its original state. Greenson, Murray, and possibly others have been inside the room before police documentation began. This fact alone does not imply wrongdoing, but it does mean that the integrity of the scene was compromised before official observation. When police entered the bedroom, they documented the following. Marilyn Monroe was lying on her bed, face down, with her head turned to the side. Her right hand was clutching a telephone receiver. Empty prescription pill bottles were found on a nearby nightstand. No suicide note was present. No glass of water was visible in the room. The locked bedroom door was noted, but police also confirmed that entry had already been forced. The lighting conditions became a point of contradiction. Some reports indicated the bedroom light was on. Others suggested it had been turned off by the time police arrived. This discrepancy was never fully resolved. At approximately 5 a.m., the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office was notified. The body was later transported for autopsy. Initial media reports began circulating by early morning. By sunrise, radio stations were reporting Marilyn Monroe's death. By midday, newspapers across the world carried the story. Within hours, the narrative began to solidify. She had overdosed. She had been depressed. She had taken her own life. But beneath that surface, inconsistencies were already visible. The autopsy, performed later that day, found lethal levels of barbiturates in Marilyn Monroe's system, including Nimbutal and chloral hydrate. However, toxicologists noted something unusual. No residue of pills was found in her stomach. This suggested that the drugs had either been absorbed rapidly or administered in a manner other than oral ingestion. The report did not conclude definitively how the substances entered her body. The cause of death was listed as acute barbiturate poisoning. The manner of death was classified as probable suicide, a designation that acknowledged uncertainty. Not suicide, not accident, not homicide, probable suicide. The wording mattered, because even as officials closed the case, the sequence of events from that night resisted a single, clean explanation. Why were key calls made before police were contacted? Why were accounts of the timeline inconsistent? Why was the scene altered before documentation? Why were there no physical traces consistent with swallowing large quantities of pills? These questions did not dominate headlines at the time. The public, overwhelmed by grief and shock, largely accepted the official conclusion. But investigators, journalists, and researchers would return to this night again and again. Because when the final hours are examined closely, the mystery does not begin with theories. It begins with gaps. The investigation into Marilyn Monroe's death began not as a prolonged inquiry, but as a process shaped by urgency, public pressure, and assumptions formed almost immediately after her body was discovered. From the earliest hours of August 5, 1962, the question facing authorities was not framed as what happened, but rather how quickly the case could be classified. This framing would influence every step that followed. When officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at Monroe's Brentwood home shortly after 4:30 a.m., they encountered a scene already altered by civilian intervention. This was acknowledged in police notes and later testimony. Dr. Ralph Green's son had broken a bedroom window to gain entry. Eunice Murray had been present throughout the night. Other individuals, whose exact arrival times were never firmly established, may have entered the room before police documentation began. Standard investigative protocol emphasizes scene preservation. In this case, that protocol was compromised before law enforcement arrived. Officers did not treat the home as a potential crime scene in the traditional sense. There was no immediate cordoning of the property, no systematic evidence logging, and no comprehensive forensic sweep. Instead, the working assumption formed quickly. Marilyn Monroe had overdosed intentionally. This assumption did not emerge from a completed investigation. It emerged from context, her documented struggles, the presence of prescription medications, and a locked bedroom door. The investigation moved forward within that framework. Police conducted brief interviews with those present at the home, including Eunice Murray and Dr. Green's son. These interviews were not recorded verbatim. Instead, summaries were entered into reports, relying on recollection rather than exact phrasing. This mattered later, because over time, the accounts given by these witnesses changed subtly but significantly. Eunice Murray's statements regarding when she became concerned, when she contacted Dr. Green's son, and when police were called would vary across interviews conducted over several years. In some versions, she emphasized fear and confusion. In others, calm observation. The shifts were not dramatic, but they introduced uncertainty into a timeline that already lacked precision. Dr. Greenson's account remained more consistent, but it raised its own questions. He acknowledged being deeply involved in Monroe's personal life, sometimes acting not only as her psychiatrist, but as a personal guardian figure. His presence at the scene before police arrival was unusual, though not illegal. What investigators did not do is equally important. They did not interview all individuals who claimed to have spoken with Monroe that night. They did not subpoena phone records in any comprehensive way. They did not investigate potential third-party involvement beyond cursory dismissal. They did not convene a formal inquest or public hearing. The case moved swiftly toward closure. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office took over the medical portion of the investigation later that morning. The autopsy was conducted by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, then a deputy medical examiner who would later become one of the most prominent forensic pathologists in the country. Noguchi's findings were clinical and cautious. He identified lethal levels of barbiturates in Monroe's blood and liver. He noted the absence of pill residue in the stomach. He found no evidence of external trauma. He also acknowledged limitations, specifically that decomposition and medical intervention prior to examination could obscure certain details. Noguchi did not declare suicide as a medical certainty. Instead, he listed the manner of death as probable suicide, a classification used when evidence suggests intentional self-harm but does not conclusively exclude other possibilities. This distinction is often misunderstood. Probable suicide is not a definitive ruling. It is an acknowledgement of likelihood, paired with unresolved uncertainty. The coroner's report left room, intentionally, for alternate interpretations. Despite this, public messaging from officials was more definitive. Within days, press statements emphasized Monroe's emotional struggles and history of medication use. The narrative hardened quickly. A troubled star, overwhelmed by fame, had taken her own life. This narrative served several purposes. It aligned with existing public perceptions. It reduced speculation of foul play. It allowed authorities to close the case efficiently. But efficiency came at a cost, because certain questions were never pursued. One of the most notable omissions was the lack of a formal police reconstruction of Monroe's final hours. No minute-by-minute official timeline was ever published. Discrepancies between witness accounts were noted but not resolved. Another omission was the limited scrutiny of prescription practices. Marilyn Monroe was reportedly receiving medications from multiple doctors, sometimes concurrently. Records of exact dosages, timing, and instructions were incomplete. Investigators did not attempt to reconstruct her medication intake over the preceding days in a systematic way. The role of alcohol, often mentioned in later accounts, was also not deeply explored. Equally significant was the absence of a jury inquest, which was common at the time for high-profile or ambiguous deaths. Such an inquest would have allowed testimony under oath, cross-examination, and public transparency. That did not happen. Instead, the case was administratively closed. In the years that followed, criticism of the investigation would grow, not necessarily because of evidence of homicide, but because of unanswered procedural questions. Why was there no detailed crime scene photography before the room was altered? Why were witness timelines not reconciled? Why was Monroe's phone activity not reconstructed? Why were federal agencies' interests, if any, not disclosed? As time passed, memories faded, documents were lost, and opportunities for clarification disappeared. By the late 1960s, the official position remained unchanged. Marilyn Monroe had died of acute barbiturate poisoning. The manner of death was probable suicide. The case was closed, but closure, in this instance, did not bring clarity. It left behind a structure of unanswered questions, questions that would later be filled not only by journalists and historians, but by speculation, rumor, and increasingly elaborate theories. Because when an investigation ends without fully accounting for its own gaps, those gaps do not disappear. They widen. When investigators concluded that Marilyn Monroe's death was the result of acute barbiturate poisoning, the determination rested on a limited set of physical findings, medical interpretations, and contextual assumptions. On paper, the evidence appeared straightforward. But when examined carefully, item by item, several anomalies emerge. None of these anomalies, on their own, prove wrongdoing. But taken together, they complicate the narrative and resist a single, uncomplicated explanation. This section focuses only on what was documented, what was missing, and what remains unexplained. The most central piece of evidence was toxicological. The autopsy revealed extremely high concentrations of barbiturates in Marilyn Monroe's system, particularly Nembutal, pentobarbital, and chloral hydrate. These levels were well above what was considered lethal. The cause of death, acute barbiturate poisoning, was medically sound. However, the route by which these drugs entered her body was never conclusively determined. During the autopsy, no pill residue was found in Monroe's stomach. This was noted explicitly in the coroner's report. In cases of oral overdose, especially involving large quantities of pills, some trace material is usually present unless significant time has passed or the drugs were administered in a form that dissolves rapidly. Investigators proposed several explanations. One was that the pills had dissolved completely before death. Another was that Monroe had been using enemas or suppositories, a method sometimes employed to avoid stomach irritation or speed absorption. This theory was speculative. There was no physical evidence presented to confirm rectal administration, and the coroner did not list it as a finding, only as a possibility. What mattered was not that an explanation existed, but that no explanation was verified. The absence of stomach residue remains one of the most cited anomalies in the case. Next is the scene itself. When police entered the bedroom, Monroe was found lying face down on her bed. Her body position was noted, as was the presence of a telephone receiver in her right hand. The implication, often inferred but never proven, was that she may have been attempting to call for help. However, there was no recorded evidence that a call was successfully placed after her final confirmed conversations earlier that night. No transcript, no operator record, no unanswered incoming call logged. The phone itself was not treated as forensic evidence in the way modern investigations would require. It was not fingerprinted. The timing of its placement in her hand was not determined, and no effort was made to establish whether it had been moved before police arrival. This leaves a basic question unanswered. Was the phone placed in her hand before or after death? The investigation did not attempt to answer it. The pill bottles found near the bed were another focal point. They were reportedly empty or nearly empty and prescribed by multiple physicians. Some bottles had been recently filled. Others were older. The exact number of pills originally contained in each bottle was not definitively documented. Investigators did not reconstruct a precise medication timeline. What had been prescribed, what had been taken, and when. Without this reconstruction, it was impossible to establish whether the overdose occurred all at once or cumulatively over several hours or days. This distinction matters. An intentional overdose and an accidental accumulation can produce the same toxicological result, but involve very different circumstances. The investigation did not conclusively differentiate between the two. Another notable anomaly was the absence of a glass of water. Barbiturates, especially in large quantities, are difficult to ingest without liquid. Yet no water glass was documented near the bed, on the nightstand, or elsewhere in the room. Some suggested that she may have used another beverage, or that the glass was removed before police arrived. No inventory was taken of items that may have been moved. Once again, the altered scene limited certainty. The locked bedroom door was cited as strong evidence against third-party involvement. But this, too, was less definitive than it appeared. The door was locked from the inside, according to initial reports. However, entry was gained through a broken window before police arrival. The lock itself was not subjected to forensic testing. No determination was made regarding whether it could be locked automatically or manipulated externally. Locked rooms can indicate privacy. They can also reflect habit. Marilyn Monroe was known to lock her bedroom door at night. The investigation did not establish whether the locked door was unusual behavior. Another anomaly lies in witness timelines. Eunice Murray's statements about when she noticed the bedroom light, when she became concerned, and when she contacted Dr. Greenson varied across interviews. Dr. Greenson's arrival time was approximate, not exact. Police arrival was delayed relative to the moment of discovery. This created a window of time, potentially over an hour, during which the scene was unaccounted for. In modern investigations, such a gap would be considered significant. In 1962, it was largely overlooked. There's also the issue of documentation gaps. No complete photographic record of the bedroom before disturbance exists. No detailed inventory of medications was published. No verbatim witness transcripts were preserved. No formal reconstruction was released. These omissions do not imply intentional concealment. They reflect investigative standards of the time, but their impact is lasting. Because without detailed documentation, Later analysis is constrained by absence rather than evidence. Finally, there is the classification itself, probable suicide. This designation acknowledged uncertainty. It was not a firm conclusion. It was an administrative decision based on likelihood, not proof. Yet in public discourse, that nuance disappeared. The evidence supported death by overdose. It did not conclusively establish intent. It did not exclude alternative explanations. That distinction matters, because anomalies do not overturn conclusions by themselves, but they do prevent those conclusions from being final. And in this case, the anomalies were never resolved. They were simply left behind. By the time Marilyn Monroe was laid to rest on August 8, 1962, the official story of her death had already taken hold. Yet almost immediately, alternative explanations began to circulate. Not because of a single shocking discovery, but because the existing explanation left too many questions unanswered. Over the decades, these explanations hardened into theories. Some were grounded in documented relationships and historical context. Others relied on speculation, second-hand testimony, or later interpretations of ambiguous evidence. In this section, each major theory is examined separately, using the same standard. What is claimed, what evidence supports it, what contradicts it, and why it remains unresolved. No theory is presented as definitive. The first and most widely accepted explanation remains the official ruling, probable suicide. This theory holds that Marilyn Monroe, struggling with long-term mental health challenges, insomnia, and dependence on prescription sedatives, intentionally ingested a lethal dose of barbiturates. Supporters of this conclusion point to several factors. Monroe had a documented history of depression and anxiety. She had previously overdosed, though survived, on multiple occasions. She had access to large quantities of prescription medication. She was alone in her bedroom, with the door locked from the inside. From a statistical and clinical standpoint, suicide by overdose among individuals with similar profiles was not uncommon in that era. However, this theory faces notable contradictions. Friends and colleagues described Monroe as future-oriented in the days before her death. She had spoken about work, travel, and personal plans. Negotiations were underway to resume filming Something's Got to Give. These accounts do not exclude suicide, but they complicate the narrative of imminent despair. More significantly, the absence of pill residue in her stomach and the lack of a suicide note remain unexplained. While notes are not always present in suicide cases, their absence in a case of such magnitude invites scrutiny. The suicide theory remains unresolved not because it lacks plausibility, but because it rests heavily on interpretation rather than conclusive proof of intent. A second explanation proposes accidental overdose. This theory suggests that Marilyn Monroe did not intend to die, but instead succumbed to a lethal interaction or accumulation of prescribed medications. At the time, she was reportedly under the care of multiple physicians, receiving overlapping prescriptions for sedatives and sleep aids. Medical practices in the early 1960s did not include modern safeguards against polypharmacy. Dosage instructions were sometimes vague. Monitoring was inconsistent. Drug interactions were poorly understood. Supporters of this theory argue that Monroe's chronic insomnia may have led her to take additional medication in desperation, without realizing the cumulative danger. This explanation accounts for the lack of suicide note and aligns with the coroner's inability to definitively classify the manner of death. However, accidental overdose does not fully explain the extremely high concentration of barbiturates found in her system, nor the absence of stomach residue. It also does not address the altered scene or conflicting witness timelines. As with suicide, the theory is plausible, but incomplete. The most controversial explanations involve third-party involvement. Among these, the most persistent centers on alleged relationships between Marilyn Monroe and members of the Kennedy family, particularly President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. According to this theory, Monroe possessed sensitive information, either political secrets, personal scandals, or both, and was perceived as a liability. Her death, therefore, was not self-inflicted but orchestrated to prevent disclosure. Supporters cite circumstantial elements. Reports of Monroe's emotional distress following alleged breakups. Claims that Robert F. Kennedy was in Los Angeles on the day of her death. Accounts suggesting Monroe had threatened to speak publicly. The rapid closure of the investigation. Some witnesses later claimed that Monroe kept a diary documenting her interactions with powerful figures, a diary that was never recovered. However, this theory faces serious evidentiary challenges. There is no verified documentation proving an affair with either Kennedy. No credible evidence places Robert F. Kennedy at Monroe's home that night. No physical evidence supports forced administration of drugs. Many witness claims emerged years later, influenced by media attention and financial incentives. Historians note that while the Kennedys were intensely protective of their public image, orchestrating a murder would have carried enormous risk. This theory remains unresolved not because it is proven, but because it relies heavily on inference and retrospective testimony rather than contemporaneous evidence. Another variation of third-party involvement focuses on medical negligence or cover-up. In this scenario, Monroe's death is attributed to improper prescribing practices or delayed medical response, followed by an effort to minimize liability by framing the death as suicide. Proponents point to the unusual role of Dr. Green's son, who acted not only as Monroe's psychiatrist but as a gatekeeper to her personal life. His presence at the scene before police arrival and the delay in contacting authorities have raised questions about judgment and protocol. However, negligence does not equate to homicide. There is no evidence that Green's son or other physicians intended harm. At most, this theory suggests a failure of care compounded by poor decision-making after death. It remains unresolved because relevant records were incomplete and key individuals are no longer alive to clarify their actions. Finally, there's the most speculative and controversial theory, the UFO and intelligence cover-up hypothesis. This theory emerged decades later, fueled by declassified documents, Cold War secrecy, and a culture of conspiracy that followed revelations about government surveillance. In the 1990s, a document surfaced claiming to be a CIA transcript referencing phone calls in which Marilyn Monroe allegedly discussed classified information about unidentified flying objects and government secrecy. According to this narrative, Monroe had learned sensitive information through her association with President Kennedy and threatened to expose it. Supporters argue that this would explain federal surveillance and the urgency surrounding her death. However, skepticism is widespread. The document's authenticity has never been verified. Formatting and language inconsistencies suggest fabrication. No corroborating records exist in official archives. No credible intelligence historian has endorsed the claim. Most researchers regard the UFO theory as a hoax or misinterpretation, reflective of broader anxieties rather than factual evidence. It persists not because it is credible, but because it attaches a global mystery to a personal tragedy. Across all theories, one pattern remains consistent. No single explanation accounts for every detail. No theory resolves every anomaly. Each relies on a combination of fact, interpretation, and assumption. The case endures not because the truth is hidden behind one secret, but because it lies somewhere between incomplete evidence and lost opportunity. And as time passes, the distance between what can be proven and what can be imagined continues to grow. As the decades passed, Marilyn Monroe's death did not recede into history. Instead, it entered a different phase, one shaped by declassification, forensic hindsight, media reinterpretation, and the rise of independent researchers operating outside official institutions. What changed was not the evidence itself, but the way it was revisited. Beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, a broader cultural shift encouraged skepticism toward official narratives. Revelations about government secrecy, most notably the Pentagon Papers and later intelligence oversight reforms, prompted renewed interest in unresolved deaths from the Cold War era. Marilyn Monroe's case was increasingly viewed through this lens. Journalists and biographers returned to original police reports, coroner records, and witness statements, comparing early accounts with later recollections. What emerged was not new physical evidence, but a clearer understanding of how much documentation was missing or incomplete. One of the most significant developments came from Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the pathologist who conducted Monroe's autopsy. In later interviews and memoirs, Noguchi reiterated that his ruling of probable suicide was intentional and cautious. He emphasized that the manner of death could not be conclusively determined based on available evidence. He also acknowledged the limitations of the investigation, particularly the lack of scene preservation and the incomplete medical records. Noguchi's reflections did not overturn the official conclusion, but they reinforced its provisional nature. In the 1990s, renewed interest in the case coincided with the release of declassified FBI and CIA documents related to Cold War surveillance practices. Some of these documents referenced Marilyn Monroe, not as a target of investigation, but as a person of interest due to her associations. The FBI acknowledged monitoring individuals connected to political figures, particularly during periods of heightened national security concern. These documents confirmed that Monroe existed within a surveillance-aware environment. They did not confirm espionage, blackmail, or assassination. Nonetheless, the mere presence of her name in federal files reignited speculation. This period also saw the emergence of the so-called Marilyn Monroe UFO memo. The document, circulated among UFO researchers, claimed to be a transcript of intercepted conversations suggesting Monroe knew of government UFO secrets and intended to reveal them publicly. While the memo gained traction in fringe communities, mainstream historians and document analysts raised immediate concerns about its authenticity. No provenance was established. No archival source confirmed its origin. No corroborating evidence surfaced. Today, most scholars regard the document as unreliable. It remains a cultural artifact rather than a historical one. Advances in forensic science also reshape discussions. Modern toxicology emphasizes precise dosage tracking, drug interaction modeling, and metabolic timelines. When experts revisited Monroe's autopsy data using contemporary frameworks, some suggested that accidental overdose could not be ruled out, especially given polypharmacy and the lack of coordinated medical oversight. However, without preserved biological samples, these analyses remain theoretical. The physical evidence needed to reclassify the case no longer exists. The rise of the internet in the early 2000s created a new kind of investigation. Independent researchers, journalists, and enthusiasts assembled digital archives of primary sources, scanned police reports, contemporaneous news articles, and interview transcripts. This democratization of access allowed inconsistencies to be identified more easily, but it also blurred the line between rigorous analysis and speculation. Online forums amplified both careful scholarship and unfounded claims. The result was a fragmented narrative landscape. Some researchers focused narrowly on procedural flaws. Others emphasized political context. Still others leaned into conspiratorial frameworks. What unified them was the recognition that the original investigation had left unresolved questions. In recent years, renewed public interest has been driven less by new evidence and more by cultural reassessment. Documentaries, academic studies, and long-form journalism have attempted to strip away myth and return to primary sources. These efforts tend to converge on a cautious consensus. Marilyn Monroe's death was the result of barbiturate poisoning, but the circumstances surrounding it were inadequately documented. There has been no official reopening of the case. No new forensic testing has been authorized. No revised ruling has been issued. No definitive alternate explanation has emerged. The case persists because it exists at the boundary between tragedy and uncertainty. What modern developments have provided is not resolution, but perspective. They reveal how investigative standards have evolved. They highlight the consequences of early assumptions. They demonstrate how absence of clarity invites narrative replacement. And they underscore a fundamental reality. Some historical questions cannot be answered retroactively. not because the truth is deliberately hidden, but because it was never fully captured at the moment it mattered most. On the morning of August 5th, 1962, the world was told that Marilyn Monroe was dead and that the reason was known. In the decades since, that certainty has steadily eroded. Not because new evidence has overturned the original conclusion, and not because a single hidden truth has finally come into focus, but because the more closely the case is examined, the clearer it becomes how much was left unresolved from the beginning. Marilyn Monroe died of acute barbiturate poisoning. That fact has never been seriously disputed. What remains uncertain is how and why those drugs entered her body in the way they did, and whether the circumstances surrounding her death were ever fully understood. The official ruling of probable suicide was cautious, but the public interpretation of it was not. A provisional classification became a definitive narrative. Nuance was lost. Doubt was flattened into closure. Yet the record itself never fully supported that certainty. The final hours were not cleanly reconstructed. The scene was not preserved. Witness accounts were not reconciled. Medical practices were not systematically reviewed. None of these omissions prove an alternate explanation, but together they prevent finality. Over time, the absence of clarity created space for speculation, for conspiracy, for mythology. Some theories reflect legitimate historical context, political power, surveillance, and image control in the Cold War era. Others drift far from evidence, attaching unrelated mysteries to a tragedy already burdened with symbolism. What all of them share is a response to uncertainty. Marilyn Monroe was not only a person. She was a projection of desire, vulnerability, ambition, and contradiction. In death, she became something else entirely, a question. That question persists because her life and her death occurred at the intersection of multiple systems that were not designed for transparency. Hollywood publicity, mid-century medicine, law enforcement practices, and national security culture. Each system left its mark. None fully explained what happened. And time, rather than clarifying, has narrowed the range of what can still be known. Today, more than 60 years later, the case remains officially closed. There are no pending investigations, no hidden files waiting to be unlocked that are likely to provide definitive answers. What exists is what has always existed, a record that is partial, a conclusion that is conditional, and a mystery that endures not because it is extraordinary, but because it is incomplete. Marilyn Monroe's death does not demand belief in a single theory. It demands restraint. It asks that fact be separated from inference, that probability not be mistaken for certainty, and that unanswered questions be allowed to remain unanswered. Because sometimes the most honest conclusion is not resolution, but recognition. Recognition that a life ended in tragedy. Recognition that the systems tasked with explaining it fell short. Recognition that some truths, once lost in the moment, cannot be recovered later. And so the question remains, quiet, unresolved, and resistant to simplification. Not who was responsible, not what secret was hidden, but whether the full story was ever truly known at all.